One of the most important things about Christianity is understanding how our salvation takes place. I know growing up Mormon that a lot of emphasis was put on Jesus in the suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in traditional Christianity, we talk a lot more about Jesus and his death on the cross. So let's talk about those ideas and really understand why the cross is so important and why the atonement really didn't not happen in Gethsemane. So it really goes all the way back to the very beginning of creation, right? So tell us kind of how the story begins.
Well, in the beginning, you have Adam and you have Eve, and they're in this perfect paradise, and there's no death until they partake of the fruit.
Okay.
And their first sin comes, and death comes into the world, and they're kicked out of paradise.
Okay.
And then you flash all the way forward to after Christ's crucifixion, and you have Paul telling us in Romans that the wages of sin is death.
Right, so sin and death are always connected. From the very beginning, Adam and Eve, God warned them, if you disobey me in this way, you're going to die.
Yeah.
And then later Paul affirms that and says that they're linked. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you go, and then you follow through the course of the scriptures, and you find that the Hebrews, on once a year, they have a day called Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement.
Okay.
And they sacrifice an animal. That means kill an animal.
Actually kill the animal.
Yeah. And that's supposed to atone for their sins for the year.
For the year. Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, I would say, moving forward, you have to have death for God's perfect justice to be complete.
Right. So that's interesting. In the Old Testament system, the sacrificial system in the tabernacle and the temple, that's a great point, because whenever there was sin, it had to be paid for by the death of an animal as a substitute for the person who sinned. I remember, like the Bible talks about that person putting their hands on the head of the animal as a way of identifying personally with that beast. And then that animal is killed on behalf of the individual or on behalf of the whole nation on the day of Yom Kippur. So death and sin are still connected, just like we saw a minute ago. Okay. And so then how does that bring us then to the sacrifice of Jesus?
I mean, at that point, you look at the Garden of Gethsemane, and you can call it anxiety, you can call it whatever it is, and he very well could have been suffering in many ways.
Sure.
But it can't have been payment for sin.
Okay.
And blood was always required as payment for sin and death.
Death,
And therefore,
yeah.
it had to have been moved onto the cross. It couldn't have taken place in the garden.
Yeah, we know that Jesus really was wrestling with God in the garden. He says, if it's possible for me not to go through this, God, then please, and he was being deserted, and all these things were happening to him, but he didn't die in the garden.
No.
And we've seen that death is required to atone for sin, right?
Yeah.
And so whatever happened in the garden, and however meaningful it might have been, it wasn't.
Yeah, you didn't pay with sin by bleeding the lambs.
Right.
You paid for sin by killing the lambs.
That's a great point. It wasn't that the lambs just bled, but they gave their life. That is a great point. And so, what impact do you think that has on Mormons and their understanding of salvation and atonement?
Well, if you put the suffering for sin in the garden, then death on the cross, it was just tying a little ribbon on top of the package. And where really everything, when Christ said it is finished, it was on the cross.
He said that on the cross.
Completed.
Good point.
And it wasn't in the garden. So it undermines really what the cross and what Christ did for us by going to the cross and taking his sins upon us.
Yeah. And the cross is so important to our salvation, that God so loved the world that he gave his son, and he gave him to die. It's so important that you could understand how different groups in history have sought to minimize the significance and the centrality of the cross. And so what that does is it somehow then minimizes the work of Jesus.
Yep.
Right? And that's what it's all about.
Yep.
And so think about how many times the Apostle Paul talks about the cross, the cross, the cross. And so if you're transitioning out of Mormonism and you see that the church you're going to puts a lot of emphasis on the cross, and nobody really talks about the Garden of Gethsemane much, well, this is why. Because the cross is where Jesus died to pay for our sins so that we can be forgiven and we can have relationship with God.